Okay, good evening. It's so exciting to be here. We look to Canada and particularly to the wonderful Muriel McQueen Ferguson Centre as being, really the flagship place where domestic abuse in churches are being researched. So it's very exciting for us to be here. We've presented the UK research so far in a few different countries. We think this is the fifth. So it's been to Japan, to Portugal, to Belgium, to Australia, and now here, furthest north so far. So it's good to be here. We're presenting today about this report, which came out last year. In Churches 2, Church Responses to Domestic Abuse, a case study of Cumbria. Cumbria is a region of northwest England that I'll mention a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about why did we do this, what was the context for the research, and then Becky is going to talk about what we found. We did this essentially because this was a topic that had been really neglected in the UK situation, and we wanted to rectify this omission. So if we think first at the context, both the social context and also the academic context. In the UK, the figures about who experiences abuse at the moment suggests that around 29% of women and 30% of men have experienced domestic abuse since the age of 16. And yet the church hasn't really done that much about it, but could be an amazing support resource for victims and for survivors. So it's really like, how do we bring together the context of this fairly high figure, prevalence figure, against the fact that the church could offer so much but isn't necessarily doing so. The church is, in the UK, although church-going is declining, we still have about 60% of people who are identifying as Christian, around 10% or perhaps a little bit less attending church at least once a month. And so it remains the largest religion in the UK. Now, why we did the study? Well, we were approached by a really brilliant charity called Restored, who are a Christian domestic abuse education charity who have been around now for about 5 years, and they had been doing training of churches, and they would often approach churches and say, can we deliver training to you on domestic abuse? And sometimes the church leaders would say to them, well, we don't need that. We don't have that problem in our church. And so, they realized that they needed to be able to convince the churches that they needed the training. So if there could be research that showed that domestic abuse does also happen in churches, then there would be more appetite for their training, and then the training would have a chance to affect the lives of victims and survivors. So this is why we did the research, essentially, to serve the needs of Restored and therefore of the wider church. There was also some really great work being done in this particular region of northwest England, Cumbria, where they had developed some training that church leaders and also other representatives in the church were undertaking on domestic violence awareness. So as a result of that partnership, we thought, well, if we were to focus on one area of the UK and do a sort of in-depth study of one region, that then perhaps in the future we could do a national version, and perhaps even, we've been talking the last day or so about whether we could have an international version of that with colleagues here. We used the connections that this ecumenical group in Cumbria that was called Churches Together in Cumbria had. So we had their database of churches that we could access. So that's a little bit about the context. Academically, as I mentioned, not that much research had been done, particularly not in the UK. And we have been really dependent on and admiring of the research that has been done in North America, and particularly the research that has been done here. Of course, Professor Nancy Nathan Clark, who is sitting here at the front, has been an absolute pioneer in this area, and we're very grateful for the work that you have done and encouraged us in. And it's very clear from the review of the literature that we did that religion is not antithetical to domestic violence. So religion is not the opposite of violence. In fact, they are often connected, and that faith communities need to face up to this fact. The research we looked at shows that churchgoers experience probably as much domestic violence as non-churchgoers. There are some quantitative researchers, so for example, Ellison and Anderson, who argue that going to church is a protective factor against domestic abuse, so that there's less abuse within churches, and they do demonstrate that regular church going is associated with lower rates of physical abuse. However, when you look at other aspects of abuse, so emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, for instance, you actually find that there isn't really a difference, because churchgoers may not be doing perpetrating as much physical violence, but they are perpetrating lots of other kinds of abuse as well. So, as Nancy Nathan Clark summarises, there is ample evidence that religious faith and domestic abuse are commingled. One question that is often asked of us and of Restored, the charity we worked with, is whether certain kinds of churches are better or worse for domestic abuse. So, for instance, Restored have evangelical roots, and they are often asked, well, are evangelical churches worse or better? We did a review of the literature to sort of try and answer this question, and I would say actually literature doesn't seem to show theological differences or denominational differences to be a significant factor, although those differences may affect some of the kind of nature and dynamics of abuse. So it might mean that, for instance, evangelicals might be more likely to encourage the couple to reconcile and to not divorce, for instance, because of teaching around divorce. So we became quite interested in the question of theology. So kind of what role does or might theology play in domestic abuse? And we haven't yet really answered that. And that is something that we would be interested in answering in future studies. But I would say it's true that it shapes domestic abuse both positively and negatively. So theology, might have a negative role, for instance, in reinforcing certain forms of gendered roles. Man as the authority figure, women as the nurturers who must submit to whatever their husbands want them to do. And there is qualitative research where Christian women have been interviewed who've said things like, my husband used the Bible to justify the abuse and said, well, it's your role to submit because you're my wife. So we do see evidence of Bible verses being used in really negative ways. I came across this quotation from a marriage manual called Created to Be His Helpmeet, which I think is quite disturbing. The author argues what God says stands regardless of the man's goodness or the apparent lack thereof. You were given your blueprints, words like honour, submit and reverence. It's God's will. It is up to us to believe and obey. There are also issues related to teachings about forgiveness, teachings about divorce, that might lead women to stay in violent relationships. And sometimes these are, very well-meaning teachings given by church leaders in counselling situations. Sometimes they are teachings given in sermons or inferred from sermons. and they are internalized sometimes by women in unhelpful ways. So it might be that the pastor doesn't think that he's teaching that you should stay with a violent partner, but the way that the woman interprets it, maybe because of other literature that she's read, or how other church members are explaining to her that she should understand this teaching, that may lead her to think that she has to stay in a violent relationship. So we also need to look at the difference between official teachings and what we might call everyday theologies, how people understand and interpret the Bible and church teaching in their own life. As Nancy Nathan-Clark has pointed out, that women in abusive relationships often do not see themselves as battered wives, but they see themselves as being in a troubled marriage, and they see themselves as responsible for that troubled marriage. Forgiveness is another issue that I'm sure we'll talk about quite a lot throughout these couple of days, that women may feel that they have to continually forgive, that they are following the example of Jesus in submitting to suffering, and that might be what God requires of them. But theology can also have a very positive role in victims' and survivors' lives. So it can help them to reflect. It may be that they encounter new theological understandings that really help them to challenge some of the interpretations that they've been around in their churches. It may be that positive experiences of prayer, of Bible reading, give them strength to maybe consider leaving an abusive partner, to rebuild their lives after abuse. Perhaps feminist interpretations, feminist theologies can help here sometimes as well. And in the UK context, there are a number of Christian domestic abuse trainers who are people who've survived abuse and who've gone on to write and teach about this topic. So people including Kuda Kwashenai Kuda, who runs a training organisation called Carmel Wellness, Natalie Collins, who's just published a book called Out of Control, Couples, Conflict and the Capacity for Change. There's an interesting theologian that I met recently she's also an anthropologist. She's kind of like a combination of anthropologist and theologian. And she has studied domestic abuse in many different societies. Elizabeth Kirping is her name. And she actually argues that when male dominance is justified by churches, this is in itself a sin. So male dominance is a sin in itself because it denies the full humanity of men and women. And I think that does reflect a trend within the church to see domestic abuse as, not necessarily just an individual sin, but actually as a structural sin. So patriarchy is a consequence of sin and the fall, rather than being God's design for humanity. But there is still a conflict, I think, amongst Christians about that. So what did we do? What did our study involve? So I've mentioned a little bit already. Cumbria we studied because there was already this great work going on, and there was already a kind of database of churches that we could use to reach congregations. So we designed a questionnaire. We tested it in a church in London, and then refined it. And we then selected in Cumbria a sample of churches. So we had all the churches in the database, and then we selected 230 with proportions of different denominations, broadly based on the proportion of those different churches in the local area. And importantly, we compared churches where they had already undergone some kind of domestic violence awareness training from the organisation I mentioned earlier, Churches Together in Cumbria. We wanted to compare those churches with ones where they hadn't had any training to see, does the training make a difference? we found, yes, the training does make a difference, but Becky will talk a little bit about that there. So we contacted those churches and we said, will you participate in our study? And it depended on church leaders saying, yes, we will circulate your request for participants in our news sheet, or we will read it out. They didn't all agree. A lot of them ignored our emails. So we had our colleague and research assistant, Alison Halford, phoned up lots of church leaders and was very persuasive. And as a result, we got a good response from them. We also had a second phase where we contacted things like ecumenical groups, university Christian student societies, so other things that were Christian but were not church related in the local area, so that we could try and capture people that the other methods had missed. And of course, we put in ethical safeguards. It was anonymous. Confidentiality was important. We didn't want people to complete the survey, for instance, with their husband or their wife present. So various things we did to ensure it was as confidential as it could be. And this was the aim of the study. So we were wanting to look at rates of domestic abuse amongst churchgoers. We were wanting to find out a bit about the nature and dynamics of domestic abuse for churchgoers, and we wanted to find out the attitudes within the churches. So importantly, the survey was not for people exclusively who had experienced abuse. We entitled it Church Responses to Domestic Abuse. So we said, researchers from the two universities are doing a study of how churches respond to domestic abuse. We'd like to hear from as many people as possible about how you feel the church is doing on this issue. So it importantly was not directed just to survivors or victims. And we wanted to find out what had happened when and if people had sought support from churches. Okay, I will hand over now to Becky, who will talk about the findings.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to switch on. Is that working? Yeah. Okay, super. Right. So, what resulted from the survey was 438 usable questionnaires, and that makes it the largest ever academic survey of churchgoers in the UK. Now, in terms of our sample, there's a few kind of important points to acknowledge. The majority of the sample, 3/4, were female. This isn't a great surprise, given both kind of patterns of church membership in the UK, but also in terms of interest in the topic as well. Although, as Kristen said, the survey was for everyone, often things to do with domestic violence are seen to be a kind of feminised topic. The vast majority of the sample, almost 98%, were white, or identified as white. That is higher than the UK population, but Cumbria is a very rural county that is predominantly, almost exclusively, white British, and so that's fairly kind of in keeping with the Cumbria area. What was quite surprising, again, not so surprising given the rural context of Cumbria, is that the majority of the participants, almost 70%, were aged over 60, which is quite unusual in other kind of domestic violence research in the UK. And in terms of church attendance, almost half of them attended Anglican churches, so that was the biggest group, followed by Methodist churches, followed by a Roman Catholic, and then various other denominations as well, and free churches too. Now, the vast majority were regular churchgoers. This is important to highlight because sometimes when research is produced about domestic abuse in the church, and if people are kind of reluctant to believe the findings, they might say, well, they're not really real Christians or they're not actual proper churchgoers. But actually, the vast majority were attending at least monthly, sometimes much more, and over half of them held a leadership role. And that included clergy roles, but also included a whole range of lay leadership roles. It's picking up that, I think, isn't it? Okay. Now, one of the first areas we asked about in the survey was perceptions of domestic abuse amongst our churchgoers. And what we found is that churchgoers were much more likely to say that domestic abuse was a problem in their local community that they were aware of. But when we asked about whether it was a problem in their church, about half of the numbers, almost 50% fewer, thought that it was a problem in their church. And that's concerning because what it shows is kind of this reinforcement of the false belief that domestic abuse is something that happens out there in the community, but not in here in the church. And that kind of low awareness was mirrored by the finding, and it's a finding that kind of Dr. McMullen has referred to already in relation to church leaders not being kind of prepared to appropriately respond. That our participants, 2 in 7, thought that their church was adequately equipped to deal with the disclosure of domestic abuse. So pretty low rates of confidence in how prepared their churches would be. And therefore we can infer from that how likely they would be to seek support or to recommend that anyone else would seek support from their church. Now, when we asked people if they were aware of someone in their congregation who was experiencing domestic abuse, it tended to be that those who were younger, those who held a leadership role, and importantly, those who'd attended domestic abuse awareness training were most likely to say yes. And so that reinforces the importance of that training for people being better positioned to offer support to survivors to be able to recognise some of the signs that someone might be in an abusive relationship and to be approachable to them. Continuing with thinking about how churches respond to domestic abuse, we asked participants about 5 different activities that their church might be involved in and how often these things happen. So we asked about whether domestic abuse was talked about in sermons. We asked whether prayers had been said for people experiencing domestic abuse, whether the church donated money or goods or partnered with a refuge or other domestic abuse charity, whether there were posters and leaflets around. Now, this is quite small to see, but the greyish kind of charcoal colour represents these things not happening at all. And so we can see that it was most common for people to say that these things never happened in their church. In about a quarter of cases, people were saying that it happened regularly, that's the lime green, or sometimes, which is the orange. So it's encouraging to see that there is some activity happening, but there's still a long way to go. People were then asked to write in their own words how their church was responding to domestic abuse. And we can kind of see that 3 groups formed. So the largest number said that their church did very little, and they kind of tried to explain this by saying that in some cases theirs was a very small congregation or a very elderly congregation that perhaps didn't have the capacity. It was a very rural community, which in some cases meant that people didn't think that it was an issue in their community. They would know if it was happening. In other cases, people named a culture of silence as a barrier to their church doing more. In the middle, some people said that their church did some work, so maybe supporting an organisation, kind of providing information about helplines or posters, praying for victim survivors. And then a much smaller number said that their church was very active and kind of had established relationships with domestic abuse charities, for example. But echoing what Joel and Taylor have said, but this time in relation to church members rather than seminarians, it's really positive to see that there is an appetite for the church to become a place where people who are being subjected to abuse can find support. So the large majority of the sample thought that the church should be a place where domestic abuse is discussed, and 2/3 felt that church leaders ought to be doing more to raise awareness of the problem. And so that means that there is a strong mandate to respond more proactively. Now, we asked about experiences of domestic abuse amongst churchgoers as well. And so we asked about their experiences of being subjected to a range of physical, emotional, sexual, financial, and or spiritual behaviours, both in their current intimate relationship, but also in any previous intimate relationship since the age of 16. So we said, have you experienced any of the following? And we've got a screenshot from the questionnaire here. So we asked them, for example, has your partner ever slapped, pushed or shoved you? And then they were asked to say how frequently that happened, either from never, ranging through to at least weekly. So with each of the types of abuse, there were 4 or 5 different behaviours. Now, we asked about spiritual abuse, and we kind of developed our own measures of this because this is something that often isn't asked about in domestic abuse research. And what we meant by spiritual abuse is the ways in which someone's religion or faith or belief can be used against them. So not being allowed to practice their faith, for example, being made to take part in religious or spiritual practices which they feel uncomfortable with, being ridiculed for their faith or belief. So what we found is that 1 in 4 of our participants, so 109 participants, had experienced at least one abusive behaviour in their current relationship. But it was more common that they'd experienced multiple abusive behaviours rather than just the one, especially for women. So 12 women had experienced, and likely are still experiencing sadly, between 10 and 12 different abusive behaviours in their current relationship. And perhaps one of the most sobering findings is that 6 women said that they were in relationships where they were currently in fear for their lives. And we know from the literature on kind of risk assessment and domestic abuse that a survivor's self-assessment of risk is very accurate. So people are much more likely to downplay the risk that they're at rather than to exaggerate that risk. Now, in terms of what we might call lifetime prevalence, so looking at all experiences since the age of 16, we found that just over 42% reported having ever experienced at least one behaviour in a current or previous relationship. But we're very cautious of saying that that means that 40% of the sample have been victims or survivors of domestic abuse. So there are some really important caveats that we need to be aware of, and that includes the context in which some of those behaviours were enacted, and also needing to understand more about the motives behind different behaviours, because ticking one behaviour doesn't necessarily make someone a victim or survivor of abuse. And here we find it useful to talk about the work of Michael Johnson, who some of you might be familiar with. He's a US domestic violence scholar, and he developed a typology that recognised that there's more than one type of intimate partner violence. So he distinguished between what he called intimate terrorism, or more recently he uses the words coercively controlling violence. And that's a repeated and often escalating chronic pattern of violence and abuse and control that's perpetrated by the abuser, typically a male abuser, using that behaviour against a female victim survivor. And it causes intense fear and entrapment that's very difficult to escape from. On the other hand, he talks about situational couple violence, and that occurs when one or both partners use violent or abusive behaviours in response to escalating conflict. It might be associated with alcohol consumption or difficulties in communicating in a relationship, but it doesn't lead to that ongoing fear and entrapment in an abusive situation. So we've got to be careful not to minimise situational couple violence, because the violence can still be very serious, potentially even fatal in some cases. But it's important to recognise that the psychological impacts of situational couple violence, and really importantly, the interventions that are required, are different from intimate terrorism. So we looked at gender and age differences, and it might be surprising to see that in terms of the headline figures, there's very little gender difference. So similar proportions of men and women said that they had experienced at least one abusive behaviour. Now, in terms of age, we compared those who were above and over the age of 60. That's very crude, but because we had such a majority of the sample being aged 60 plus, we couldn't really cut it up in any other way. What we found is that those people who were aged 60 and over were considerably less likely to disclose experiences of abusive behaviours. But we can see from other attitudinal statements in the questionnaire, for example, people over 60 are more likely to kind of endorse the view that it's their duty to make their marriage or relationship work, that this isn't that over 60s are experiencing less domestic abuse, but that there are additional barriers to disclosing abuse. So as I said, at face value, it seems that men and women are experiencing similar levels of domestic abuse. But what we see when we drill down is a very different and much more gendered picture. So we can see that there are some stark gender differences when it comes to, firstly, types of abuse. So women were more likely to report that they've experienced sexual, financial, and spiritual abuse. So, for example, women were 4 times more likely to say that they'd experienced sexual abuse on at least one or more occasion. In terms of frequency, when men said that they had experienced abusive behaviours, they tended to say that this was the lowest level of frequency, so once or twice ever. And very few men appeared to have experienced systematic abuse in their intimate relationships. And then in terms of number of behaviours, women were more likely to experience a whole range of different behaviours rather than men who tended to have reported 1 or 2. And that pointed to a more systematic chronic pattern of what I mentioned, intimate terrorism amongst women. And importantly, in terms of impacts, women reported a higher number of impacts of abuse. And the most common impacts were diminished self-esteem, depression, feeling trapped. And it's also really important to highlight that the kind of most severe impacts in terms of kind of fear of risk to one's own life or fear for the safety of one's children were disproportionately reported by women. So all of those who'd experienced one or more behaviour, we asked whether they thought that they had experienced domestic abuse. And over half of the women who answered that question said that that was the case, compared to only 16.7% of the men. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this difference. It could be that what men are reporting isn't kind of domestic abuse. There are different dynamics going on. They could be reporting kind of unhappy rather than abusive relationships. But it's also important to recognise the potential barriers to men defining as having experienced domestic abuse because of the more hidden nature of male victimisation. Something that's also really important to highlight is that out of all of those who self-defined as having experienced domestic abuse, 90% talked about a perpetrator who was male, and over half talked about a perpetrator who was Christian. And this is, again, a really important finding because it challenges the kind of idea, the myth that can sometimes be used to justify the idea that domestic abuse isn't really a problem in the church by saying that this is a problem of survivors of domestic violence, typically women, being unequally yoked. So if they were married to a Christian, this wouldn't have happened. And yet we can see from this that that's not the case. In over half of the situations, there were children under the age of 16 in the home. And so clearly impacts there to consider in terms of how domestic abuse affects those children's lives. Now, we also asked about help seeking. And we asked about help seeking both inside and outside of the church. And what we found is that people who'd sought help for domestic abuse were more likely to have done so outside of the church. The services that they'd used included health professionals, police, counsellors, domestic abuse services, as well as seeking informal support from friends and family. And some had received positive responses that had empowered them and had facilitated them leaving the abusive relationship. In other cases, responses were negative and jeopardised their safety or even colluded with the abuser. Now, in terms of why people didn't seek support from their churches, in some cases it was simply that they weren't involved with a church at the time. But in other cases, the reasons that they gave were feeling too embarrassed or ashamed, feeling that it was their duty to make the relationship work, particularly amongst older participants, and not knowing or trusting anyone at their church well enough. And that's a really important kind of finding to note, that actually people can be part of church communities for a long time, but still not feel that they know or trust anyone enough to be able to disclose. So of those who answered the question, 1 in 4 women, or less than 1 in 4 women, and 1 in 6 men did seek help from a church. And in just over half the cases, the response that they received was supportive. Typically, it took the form of emotional support or a listening ear or sometimes prayer. It didn't necessarily change the circumstances that they were in, but they felt more supported in those circumstances. But in other cases, there were very concerning examples of dangerous practice and disclosures of abuse being minimised or silenced. So someone recounted that they had kind of finally plucked up the courage after years to tell their priest that they were experiencing abuse from their husband, and the priest responded by taking them back to their husband. The majority had sought help more than 10 years ago, which is important to kind of acknowledge, but there were more recent experiences as well. And so this shows that there's a need to make sure that steps are taken to facilitate opportunities for help seeking and to embed responses which help rather than harm survivors. Just over half of the sample were aware of places where they could signpost survivors of domestic violence to in the community. And those people who'd completed the domestic abuse awareness training were much more likely to know where to signpost victim survivors to. And that, again, underpins how important that training is. It's also worthwhile noting that some participants said that because they had received our questionnaire, which included a list of sources of support, they now had that and could use that as a resource. And so it just kind of shows how transformative the process of just doing research can be for providing that information and equipping people. So we asked people in their own words to talk about what churches can do to improve. And a number of issues arose. The need for greater awareness and discussion of domestic abuse. So being open was something that came up over and over again. Openness, admitting that it happens, breaking the silence, whether that be through displaying posters or leaflets, through preaching, through prayer. Training was also highlighted, but participants recognised that clergy were under multiple pressures. So they were saying it shouldn't just be clergy who undertake the training, but it should be other members of the church as well. And they said that it would be a good idea, although this does actually exist in this context, if there was a domestic abuse kind of champion model, so that one person in each church is a champion who has that kind of particular expertise and focus. They recognise the need for confidential, non-judgmental listening and support, and strengthening church communities to be able to foster those relationships of support. So overcoming that barrier of not knowing anyone or trusting anyone well enough. And also they highlighted the importance of signposting. And the key point that many participants made here is that churches shouldn't try and make themselves the expert agencies in responding to domestic abuse. So they shouldn't be trying to deliver victim, survivor or perpetrator services in isolation. And harm can be caused, as one participant described it, by well-meaning amateurs. So it's about making sure that those relationships are in place. And in relation to that, participants highlighted the importance of partnering both with other churches in an ecumenical approach, but with domestic abuse organisations in the community. And that relates to what Dr. McMullen has already referred to with kind of the importance of that wider, holistic, coordinated community response. So supporting each other, sharing knowledge, sharing resources. And then safeguarding was also highlighted. And so most major denominations in the UK have taken steps to develop national safeguarding policies and practices, but there's evidence that that still needs to filter down and become embedded at the local level. Now, a couple of quotes from participants in terms of kind of looking at what are the needs. So the first is, I'll read them out in case they're not clear to see, from a female participant aged 80 plus, Methodist. Much more friendship and keeping in touch with less interference or lip smacking or any sort of condemnation or criticism. A victim I knew who had stuck to church going through very distressing physical and mental abuse, but had very seldom been visited by her minister or elder once a year for money. When she finally left her husband, she was told by her minister, "We don't want your sort here." Another female participant, aged 70 to 79, Roman Catholic, used appropriate passages in the Gospel during the homilies to refer to domestic abuse. Offering mercy and pardon to abusers would make it easier for victims, as they would not be seen as disloyal or troublemakers, but in a situation in need of prayer. There's many more voices in the full report. Now, in terms of recommendations, our report ends with 15 recommendations that are structured around Restored's 4 R's of responding to abuse. So, for example, churches should recognise that domestic abuse happens in churches too, and that a significant proportion of churchgoers, both female and male, are experiencing it, or have previously experienced it, or have perpetrated it themselves. Respond, that churches should give the consistent message that domestic abuse is wrong and contrary to Christian teachings. Refer, mainstream secular domestic abuse services can benefit from partnership working with churches to ensure that they have that fuller awareness of spiritual forms of abuse, which they're unlikely to be aware of, and that they can better understand what the needs of faith, of survivors of faith are, and how they can work with churches to best meet those needs. And record, that churches should be recording all disclosures of domestic abuse from both the perpetrator and the survivor. So something we really want to highlight is the importance of all church leaders and at least one church member undertaking training on domestic abuse and working towards developing that kind of champion model where they can be a beacon for responding well to domestic abuse. So in summary then, churches remain key institutions in many communities and are able to reach more people than many other community organisations, not just in terms of those who are worshipping, but those who are passing through the doors to take part in the many activities held there. There's considerable potential for churches to either help or hinder, so training is vital to ensure that responses are appropriate and that they're safe. Recognising that domestic abuse happens in churches too is absolutely key. And those disclosures of ongoing systematic abuse that we've heard about from the Cumbrian context, and we know that those are happening all over the place internationally and nationally too, mean that urgent action is required. And some of that includes more national, international and qualitative research to drill down and understand experiences in more detail. So restoredrelationships.org is where you can get hold of some more really useful resources from the charity Restored that we've worked with, but also the full copy of the research report. And I'd like to end with just a couple of quotes that are really powerful from survivors who took part in this research. Churches need to encourage reality of life, that they are there as hospitals for the broken and not palaces for the perfect. A place where the broken and insecure can feel safe and find healing, filled with real people and not perfect plastic people. And a second, the fact that the church is an open door can be a blessing and a problem. A blessing as it welcomes the stranger, and a problem as it allows them somewhere to hide. Thank you.